coming tonight and enjoying this Zoom lecture and conversation with us. The Newport Historical Society considers itself extremely lucky to have been able to work with John Tschirch as a visiting curator of urban history over the past 18 months. This project, of which the book Newport, the Artful City is the culmination, was born out of a fascination with Newport's streetscapes, which still retains so much from earlier eras. If a historian's desire is to tear the fabric of time and look back, Newport is a wonderful place to contemplate that. John has been a delight to work with. His scholarly presence is tempered by an easygoing good nature and a really great sense of humor. We had a lot of fun doing this project, and there was a lot of laughing. In addition, it must be said that none of this would be possible without the support of the EJMP Fund for Philanthropy, Lisette Prince, and Rob Negro. Thank you, Lisette, for making this possible. The result was lovely, and the process was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and hello everyone out there. This project, Newport, the Artful City, has been rewarding, complex, multi-layered, and visually rich, just like the city itself. And I have worked in Newport a long time, but being able to look at it with fresh eyes and from this particular perspective has been so rewarding and eye-opening. To take the city in its totality. I have worked with individual buildings, gaining landmark recognition for them, etc., so forth. I'm very interested these days as an architectural historian in whole places. Half of what I do is establishing the data. How did the physical thing evolve? The second part of the story I'm always interested in is how have people responded to that? Facts are facts, we hope, but cultural interpretation is a sliding scale. It's whose perspective is it? Newport is very rich in both of these things because of the nature of it's one of the most historically intact communities in North America with many people who came to look at it and record it. So let's go on. I'm only showing you a tip of the iceberg. I want to share tonight some of the rich archives that I encountered to help document this story and also tell a story. If we think of it, the foundations of Newport, you know, when European settlers first came to Newport in 1639, they did not encounter a virgin wilderness. There had been the presence of humankind in Aquinic Island for centuries, as far as we know, even before recorded time. In 1524, when Giovanni de Verrazzano sailed into Newport Harbor, when he was on his expedition of the north coast of North America, on behalf of Francois I, the King of France, he wrote a letter to His Majesty and talked about and discussed his observations of the cultivation of land, of the settlements that were moved from season to season. Now, once permanent settlement came on behalf of European colonists who came from Massachusetts Bay, this is what they settled. And in 1638 and 39. This map, one of the earliest, not the earliest, but one of the earliest, and frankly, one of the easiest to read and comprehend, is by Charles Blaskowitz. And it's from 1777. And in many ways, you see the fruition of the colonial city here. It had reached its apogee, you know, as a major seaport in global trade within the British Empire. I always say you can read cities like a book, and Newport has many chapters in the way in which Americans settled their land in certain ways throughout the centuries. If we see this if you can follow my cursor, here is the triangle that is nowadays Washington Square. Behind it, the Spring, one of the early areas of settlement, one of. And then, of course, Thames Street and Spring Street were laid out by 1640. So Newport was never subject to a grand plan or a single vision in urban design, and that's key to understand. It was not planned at once. The earliest, one of the earliest planned cities, excuse me, is New Haven, Connecticut, actually. And then later on, Colonial, Williamsburg, Philadelphia, Savannah. These two streets were planned, but that's it. Commerce and freedom of conscience are what determined colonial Newport. And how does that play out in the physical life? The wharf was essential. Frankly, the wharves are the most prominent part of this plan. And then the streets run up from that because real estate was so valuable along the waterfront. And this is typical of most of coastal trading New England, the mid-Atlantic. Narrow plots of land were owned. And in many ways, the streetscapes developed, by and large, following those property lines. Then, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Nicholas Easton bequeathed the Point to the Society of Friends. And it was laid out in this grid pattern by Samuel Easton, a member of the Society of Friends. And in the minutes of the Society of Friends at the Historical Society, I paraphrase, but the Society of Friends said we should consult our brethren in Philadelphia, which had been laid out in a grid pattern with streets named after numbers and trees, because it appealed to the Quaker sense of plainness, of modesty, because you do not name a street after a person. It's a number and a tree, and a degree of equality. Now, the neighborhood would develop, land would be subdivided, but that's how it started out. So that's a concept. Now, the grid itself goes back to ancient times, which I write about in the book. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, reinvented in the Renaissance. When they were laying out the Point, do we think they were invoking the spirit of ancient Rome? I doubt it. The Quakers were learned, but I think the grid ended up in the DNA of people planning their communities because it was practical and it did have this sense of economy and modesty about it. This drawing was done on the eve of the Revolution. Let's look at Broad Street here. Broad Street is in this direction because the map makes quite clear it was the path of least resistance. So, grand city planning is not always about visions of grand boulevards. It's about where's the hill and where's the water. So this is Broad Street. And over here, it might be hard to see, this was called Tanner Street. It became West Broadway in the 19th century and Dr. Marcus Wheatland Boulevard later. There's a blow up in the book. There's a small stream here. There are little rivulets coming out of the springs here. And that accounts for this maze of streets in and around the Colony House. Religious buildings. No one religious building dominates the cityscape of Newport. Here's Trinity Church, squeezed between two streets. Because again, no one religious group dominates, and that affects the city plan. In terms of admiration for their city, it's not the earliest, but this is a very early painting of a cityscape in North America. This is the Parade, as it was known, later Washington Square, in the collection of the Historical Society from the early 1800s. You can see by the Empire gowns. What you see, though, is a cityscape from the 18th century. The merchants' houses here, very pride of place. You would be standing on the steps of the Colony House. That's the perspective in this, a political building. This is the main axis created in colonial Newport, down Long Wharf. And here by 1762-63, Peter Harrison's Brickmarket building. Think about that. This was never planned at once. The Colony House and Brickmarket were built on available land. But Colony House was positioned in that funny way on purpose so it would form an axis with Long Wharf, which had been created by 1680. A commercial building and a political building are at the heart of the town, not a religious building. And let's think of how the town evolves over time. We move into the 19th century. This is a bird's eye view of Newport from 1878. What is so key is the perspective. The earlier map of colonial Newport focused on the harbor. This map focuses in the foreground on the beach and on the cliffs. Newport was becoming a resort. So these urban scapes, these views, do reflect the values and the priorities of a certain time. Here's the old colonial town, intact. Here is that newly created street called Bellevue Avenue, established in 1853. It opened up all of the farmland to development. Alfred Smith was one of the key developers in town, along with Joseph Bailey. Alfred Smith, as a developer, was quoted as he was described, I mean to say, as creating the aristocratic boulevards of Newport. That's a marketing ploy as well, as Newport is becoming a fashionable summer resort in the 19th century. And then the Newporters, George Champlin Mason, descended from a family with long established roots in Newport to the colonial period. He was a painter, he was an architect, he was also editor of the Mercury. And he championed the idea of Newport as a summer resort and championed the idea of the picturesque scenery. And so once this was established, he lobbied for this little road, Ocean Drive, technically Ocean Avenue. It was laid out in 1867. That's important because as the cottages were being built here, and they were dividing the land up, this is flat terrain, flat, easy grid. This is rough terrain. This was being done at the same time Frederick Law Olmsted was planning Central Park. It's not the first, but it's one of the earliest scenic drives in the nation. And rather than blasting through hills, as they might have done at this time, they respected the natural topography because one caught the scenery. In 1885, Frederick Law Olmsted was invited to lay out roads in this internal area, doesn't appear yet, for the King, Glover, Bradley families, over 365 acres of serpentine roads. And Frederick Law Olmsted writes about the scenic views and rocky eminences of this area. So scenery was everything and the life of a summer resort. This is a remarkable document because this was the earliest document I had ever seen. And this is to the credit of the staff at the Historical Society, who were so generous and excited for this project and really dug in and helped me and suggested things. This is a real estate map of 1845. That's very early. The earliest atlas of Newport is 1876. The map I just showed you is 1878. That period before the Civil War can be much harder to document. Here it shows the division of lands by the Gibbs family. To give you your bearings, this is Easton's Beach, Easton's Pond. Present-day Eustis Avenue would be here. It's fascinating to me because the Gibbs go back to the colonial period. This was their farmland. Here they're subdividing it to take advantage of the rising interest in a summer resort. This is pre-Bellevue Avenue. But over here, you still see the farm, pasture, meadow, orchard, cornfield. This is Newport in these areas, farmland transitioning to summer cottages, at least in this zone. Fashion did come to town with the arrival of the summer cottages, and the city became this work of art and a place to look to for the development of houses, streetscapes. None other than William Cullen Bryant, the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, the renowned poet, the promoter of Central Park, wrote a volume called Picturesque America, in which he visited various sites. And of Newport, he wrote, "Cottages, cottages, everywhere I see a cottage." And later, the other truly prominent architectural and landscape critic, Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer, whose family summered in Newport, wrote that Newport shows that specific way of planning. Houses set on their own lots of land with thick set and lofty trees. This is from a Harper's magazine from the early 1880s, and it's called The Drive, and it shows the newly built Newport Casino by McKim Eden White. It's this sense of public theater that Bellevue Avenue was designed, I always say, and I write in the book, to tempt and taunt, to both conceal and reveal. It's a very private world behind those fences and gates, but you can see the houses. And the world was watching, and this was being published constantly. Let's take a look at the evolution of one part of Newport in the way the book uses maps and images. This is from the 1876 Atlas of Newport. This is Ochre Point. This little proposed street from 1876 will become, later that year, Ochre Point Avenue. And Mr. Lawrence will divide his land, subdivide, and this will become home to the Breakers, Vinland, which is now Solly's Macaulay Hall, Wakehurst, etc., so forth. Here is the already established George Wetmore estate, Chateau-sur-Mer, and the Auguste Belmont estate here. Fast forward to 1883, you see the wooden house known as the Breakers by Pierre Lorillard and his cousin Catherine Lorillard Wolfe at Vinland. You see this picturesque quality, the serpentine path. Mid-19th century Newport is a picturesque city. Wooden cottages, vine-covered cottages, serpentine paths. This is the style of building, the style of landscape. Ochre Point is fascinating because here you see a case study in the transformation of American taste, building patterns, and the way streets related. The landscape designer for both of these estates, and by the way, the Wakehurst we know now isn't even built yet. It will transform later. Ernest Bowditch said, I envisioned Ochre Point as one harmonious open meadow with views to the sea. That was true because these paths interconnected. The families were related. There were low fences. What happens by 1907 is here. Vinland is still there. Wakehurst is built. The new Breakers with its straight axial drives and high gates along the street, the elms, marble house, these grand classical buildings inspired by European palazzi and castles had a greater degree of privacy, radically changing the streetscape. It had its, those who celebrated it, Montgomery Schuyler celebrated the houses. Henry James called them white elephants and said someday they would stand vast and blank. The proportions were too large. I think that's important because this is a cultural touchstone. This is a neighborhood, this is a district that was built and debated about what is the meaning of American culture? What is the meaning of American art? That's the fascination for me. And I first began investigating this when I was asked to speak in 1999 at a UNESCO conference in Buenos Aires, and I presented a paper on Ochre Point as probably the most unsustainable neighborhood ever designed that somehow has survived and has sustained itself. Now, let's turn to Ocean Drive, which I'd mentioned. Ocean Drive in 1867, this shows the roadscape in 1890. Notice the openness, the sense of the road twisting and turning to take in scenic views. And in terms of scenery, what about the social scene? Newport streets became a movable theater in the 19th century. This is Puck magazine's illustration of Newport. This is very rare. Puck did not do entire scenes of cities. Puck tended to do satire, individual satirical cartoons, much like the New Yorker today, of political social life. But here it says, a sketchbook at Newport, what a Puck artist saw at society's summer capital. What I find intriguing is, yes, you have the social parade outside of the Newport Casino. Frankly, this looks like the Ascot race scene in My Fair Lady, fashion on display. But what is going on over here? Grand ladies driving by crumbling colonial buildings on the corner of Marlborough Street and Broadway. And here, driving by the old wharf area on Thames Street. This is very unique. Well, we've seen fashion, we've seen city planning. What about that earth-shaking feature of 19th century life that reshaped cities and our lives, the Industrial Revolution? Again, these photographs are remarkable in the collection of the Newport Historical Society. This shows the point, but it's the way the photograph is taken. Here you see the old Colony Railroad, which came to Newport in 1867, and the trains would come in and link up with steamships. So the point, which had been a neighborhood of sailing ships, becomes the nexus of the most modern transportation system, linking every city, the ships to New York, across the bay. This cove was eventually filled in. Long Wharf is on the left. But what is fascinating is this shows two cityscapes. The industrial cityscape, cement, iron. Here's the colonial cityscape. Buildings in a colonial cityscape go right down into the water. Speaking of technology, images show this changing feature. This is a photograph from a postcard from a photograph of about 1900. Electric lines. The electric streetcar, which was inaugurated in Newport in 1899, but the horse-drawn carriage. In Washington Square with the Colony House, now with Victorian buildings that have replaced the 18th century buildings, that sense of overlay. And you know, the streetcar was greeted with great controversy in the United States. In Newport, a group, including Cornelius Vanderbilt, Mr. Astor, Mr. Belmont formed a committee because they wanted to keep streetcars out of Newport. The dialogue in the press is fascinating because one reporter from the Providence Journal stated, and I paraphrase, "These great titans of industry seem to like their industry at home and their technology, but not in their summer paradise. The very technology that made their fortunes seems not to be welcomed in little old Newport." The streetcar did come in. It went to Washington Square. It went down Spring Street to Morton Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, and it went to First Beach, those public areas for public entertainment. Here you see the streetcars on Spring Street in 1900. If we look at the streetscape though, this streetscape is intact. Again, about 90% of Newport is intact. And we still see this streetscape today, minus the railroad cars. And let's think about the north end of the city. This is Broadway with its streetcars. The streetcars, by the way, went all the way up to the Stone Bridge in Tiverton, and you could make your way to Fall River. There was an entirely integrated public transit system by the 1890s, as well as the Old Colony train. Also, Newport did have an urban forest that was much more populated. Here you see elm trees lining Broadway. What about the points north, as I call it? Well, I know it's a small map, it's small detail, but I just have 2 points to show you, even in this complicated map. Here is the atlas of 1907. Here is Washington Square. Do you see that dotted line? Those are the streetcars. I want to show you also the house lots. Do you see a certain regularity of pattern here? The Industrial Revolution radically affected the way cities were developed because you had standardized building parts, machine manufactured lumber, machine manufactured nails. So housing lots were regularized and building types were regularized. So you begin to see a uniformity in a city plan. And the area off of Broadway, it was reported, had over 2,000 quote unquote mechanics living in it. That meant people of all types of skilled trade, metal worker, plumber, shipwright, all of this. Here's another view of it. Here's Broadway, but I want to show the north end, all farmland. This is Malbone, the Gothic Revival estate, and this is the waterfront. And Newport Bridge eventually would come in up here into this zone. You see, this is the area of summer resorts. This was very much a pastoral area. And you see, this is getting up towards 1 Mile Corner. You begin to have the development of worker housing here. All right. Now let's look at the next map. Oh, excuse me. This is one of the key landmarks. Let's go back here. This is this little plot of land is this house, which is still there. Russell Warren's Greek Revival manse called Elmhurst, which had a Sunoco station put in front of it in the 1950s, and the building's empty and still there. So this great Greek temple greeted you when you arrived in Newport. Well, let's see what the estate of Elmhurst was doing, though, by the early 1900s. I know it's small, but here's Broadway. I had shown you the left side of the map. Now I'm showing you the right side. Here's Elmhurst. They divided up the lands of the estate for worker housing. See those small plots of land? So this is becoming the working section of Newport. What's important here is this is the car shed for the electric streetcar system. You're seeing an industrial, Newport was never a major industrial center like Pittsburgh or Fall River or New Bedford, but industry still affected this streetscape. And one of the most important develops in Newport was the establishment of the Newport Gas Company and George Norman's establishment of the Newport Waterworks. And in the book, there's an essay on George Norman by Eileen Warburton. There are 2 other essays by scholars as well. George Norman established the waterworks in Newport to create a hygienic, clean city. We cannot forget the fact, looking through a romantic lens in the past, that cholera and typhus and cities could be dangerous and dirty and disease-ridden. You know, Newport was healthier, cleaner, coastal air, and George Norman went on to design waterworks in cities throughout the country. So Newport was receiving its modern infrastructure, its streetcars, its waterworks system, its gas company. One more element. This is closer in to the northern part of the point. You see here the old estates and the beginning of worker housing. And this is the Old Colony Railroad slicing right through. Now, I've talked about industry. What about the reaction to this? This is one of the earliest photographs of Newport. It's a daguerreotype from the 1840s. The vantage point is taken with the old stone mill. Basically, one could say the earliest sightseeing attraction in Newport, as supposedly the oldest building, one of the oldest structures in town. This is Toro Park, established in 1854. By the 1870s, though, American artists especially, were beginning to look to the colonial past for a source of our identity. We were reaching our 100th birthday, and they were delving. So here's an early example that this was chosen, this historic object, as the center of this photograph of a cityscape. And enter Charles Fallin McKim, the architect and partner of McKim, Mead and White, the third American educated at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. In 1874, he commissioned William James Stillman, who was quite renowned for his photographs of the Parthenon, no less, to take photographs of Newport in what is called the McKim portfolio, which is housed at the Historical Society. This is not a compendium of grand Georgian houses. They were taking the photographs of backs of vernacular buildings, these buildings which are gone behind the Colony House. McKim loved the tumble down, irregular, asymmetrical quality of these buildings and the shingled skin, because he was designing his shingle style houses. So he had this he appreciated the romantic quality and artistic quality of this city, the Artful City, so to speak. Oops, excuse me. Beyond technology and history, I think something very momentous occurred at this time as well. In 1913, the Newport Improvement Association invited the Olmsted brothers to do an improvement plan for Newport. 3 ideas were important that the Olmsteds developed, which are still important. They, in a way, lay down the template for a debate that continues. Preservation of natural scenery, considering their father, Frederick Olmsted, and their own practice. Transportation problems, traffic, and how the city would expand and develop. Here, there are several plans. This is the area of residential, parks, and the Old Colony Railroad. Now, let's think about Thames Street. This is Thames Street by the time of this report. The wharf was bustling, and the Olmsteds had a plan for widening Thames Street. So the idea of widening streets along the waterfront was as early as 1913. Now, mind you, this is Thames Street. By the 1960s, in 1965, when the historic district was established, this side is in the district, the left side was not. So the left side could be demolished. This would be the setting for urban renewal, this side for historic preservation. Dancing in lockstep, so to speak, or boxing, depending on their mood. And this was Newport 40 years after the Olmsted report. This is Bridge Street on the Point. Newport had been decaying economically. There were problems. In 1944, Life magazine did an article called Life Visits a Fading Newport. Now, the preservation movement was getting into full swing. Preservationists, by the 1960s, were saying, you preserve what is old. Urban renewal, celebrating the new movement of modernism, mid-century modernism, did not regard history, efficiency, progress, equality, opportunity. They were both, in a way, utopian visions of the city. We'll talk about the debate. Here is one, I think, a very telling cartoon from 1954. Here's Rhode Island dressed like a caveman with a pilgrim hat, which I don't think they ever wore in Newport, looking at the shining modernity of nearby cities with cloverleaf highways. Why can't Newport have its own superhighway? Well, the debate would rage on. Buildings like this, though, this is a wonderful Victorian photograph of Brickmarket, draped for the holidays. Brickmarket is a symbol to me of Newport because it's a great 18th century building, commercial building, and it's been a constant witness and survivor of change around it because it faces Washington Square, one of the oldest parts of Newport, but behind it was the site of urban renewal and complete desolation and destruction around it from 1966 when federal funding came. And that's the era when all the cities were having this experience. Here's the plan that was approved in the 1960s by city ordinance. Here is America's Cup Boulevard. So this is the part of Thames Street that was demolished from Brickmarket here, excuse me, the only building, all the way through here. This is the historic district. right next to each other. Two different philosophies of how to go and preserve Newport or preserve its economic health. Here's Brickmarket at the height of urban renewal. All the buildings torn down and the new Brickmarket Mall coming in. And so the importance of this book is I've laid down what are the character of these districts? How do they reflect the cultural forces of their time? From colonial entrepreneurship to the Victorian romanticism of the picturesque resort, to the Industrial Revolution that really fuels the northern part of the city, Broadway, the steamships and railroads, or the 20th century visions of both preservationist and urban renewal. And that, in a way, shaped the city we inherit today, because urban renewal was the last great convulsive change to the city. Newport tended to expand over time. Urban renewal was a subject of demolition. But I end with this, the last two. Here is the recreated city. Urban renewal here. Again, for all things, it's a small part of the city. Here is Brickmarket, surrounded by modernity. Here is the historic district. Here's urban renewal. But you know, if you think of Washington Square today, it is still the Artful City. This is the city with its many layers that Thornton Wilder, in his book, Theophilus North, referred to as the 9 cities of Newport. He said, sometimes grand, sometimes absurd, sometimes derelict and decaying. To me, that is the story, the layered story. Thornton Wilder said it, not me. I will leave you with that. And the book, of course, when you read it, has a great deal more. And so I will stop sharing my screen, and I think we can open it to questions, thoughts, observations.
Fallin McKim was the second graduate of the École de
Oh,
Beaux-Arts.
I'm sorry. No, he is the second. No, he is the third, because Henry Hobson Richardson was the second. Hunt, Richardson, and then McKim.
A fine point. And me, I asked if we can have integrated public transportation again, please. Anyone who can answer that is.
I think this history brings up many things. Here's a question. What was the most challenging part about compiling and researching the book? You know what the challenging part is? Dealing with an embarrassment of riches, the richness of it. And I was determined, though, this in some respects is interdisciplinary, because I'm using the framework of history of urban design, but there's certain aspects of cultural history, because I'm talking about artists and art history and writers and their response to it. So weaving that tale together was key. That was the challenging part. The wonderful part is that the archives of the Historical Society are so rich. They comprise 99.9% of the book, and the other images are from the Providence Public Library. So we're very fortunate. And I am so committed to making sure that archives get published, because they need to live out there in books or online. What is your favorite neighborhood? Do you know, when I'm asked what my favorite house is in Newport, I can say I don't have a favorite. I have favorite parts. I have favorite parts of the city. I am fascinated, actually, by the length and the breadth of Spring Street, because it goes by the Edward King House, a picturesque villa. It's intact. It gives me the feeling of what much of Thames Street would have been like, and then it ends in Washington Square. It goes by Trinity Church, so I get the taste of that.
John, Paul Harkin asks, from where was the picture of the old stone mill taken? It seems too high to be from a building.
I think it was taken at the time, from the roof of the Greek Revival Atlantic House Hotel in the 1840s, which would have stood on the site of the present-day Victorian house that is the Elks Lodge, corner of Mill Street, and because the Channing Memorial Church did not exist. Now, they did replace an earlier house. They could have been, but that vantage point is very much from the corner of the park. And Ross said how much of the Olmsted plan was realized. In the history of city planning, there are so many proposals never realized. However, eventually things were. It was their concept to expand Bath Road. Senator George Peabody Wetmore was a great advocate of that, because he was on the commission for Washington, D.C., the McMillan Plan, to, again, make sure Washington remained classical. So the Grand Boulevard, he wanted a Grand Boulevard. Mr. Wetmore managed to get some of his friends, the Mason sisters, who owned what is now St. Michael's School, Mrs. Reeves, who owned a red brick house, to give up some of their property to expand the road. He had passed on before. The Olmsteads did not receive the job to do it, but eventually Bath Road was expanded, lined with trees by after World War II, and called Memorial Boulevard after World War II in honor of the men and women who served. It had existed as a double lane, tree-lined Bath Road before that. So you see, it was incremental, if I'm being clear.
John, what was your biggest surprise in doing the book? This is from Christy.
One of my biggest surprises was actually, there's a small one, coming across the 1845 Gibbs family land division. That opened up a whole new era, because that's a lost period sometimes. You know, very few maps, very few photos of that part of town. You know, that was really remarkable to me. And I would say the other area is the North End, from Broadway to the Bay. Seeing how early those subdivisions happened and how they were done by the owners of the estates. That's key.
Diane Pearson's asking if you can speak to the history of Cliff Walk.
Cliff Walk. Well, there is a statement in 1640 from the town council: lay out the streets and keep all sea banks free. So that right of way in Rhode Island to the sea is critical. And so that's essential. And so ever since then, it has been public right of way, indisputable.
There's some good. No, go on. There's some good evidence that the Cliff Walk, that the ability to walk along that part of the island predates European arrival. Sorry, it took me a while to get that out.
Yeah, and I think that's an area that needs much more exploration. You know, where were those rights of way, and not rights of way, rights of way, it's a European concept. Where are those walking trails? Where are those paths? Absolutely. Because the Europeans were occupying a land that had been settled. They purchased the right to settle, so a land that had been settled. Do you see the prospect to get another restoration, perhaps, of Long Wharf, creating a more scenic path? Well, in the book, I also discuss in 1926, they invited Arthur Shurtleff to come to Newport to do yet another plan. Arthur Shurtleff did go on to become the chief landscape architect of Colonial Williamsburg when the Rockefellers began it in 1929, but he's in Newport in 1926. And he talked about the scenic quality of Long Wharf. He said most people at the time would go to the beaches in Ocean Drive, that this is the working waterfront. I think you need a broader plan, to be honest. Not just Long Wharf, but I think there could be a whole-scale rethinking of the area of urban renewal. America's Cup Boulevard and that wharf together, because they were subject to that together.
Ross Can asks a question that's a good follow-up to what you just said, which is, any thoughts on how to balance the need for historic preservation with economic viability and evolution?
Well, you know, if you look at these communities, and when I was doing this project, you know, Salem, Massachusetts, Boston, New York, in the book I write about Jane Jacobs and Rachel Carson. Jane Jacobs, who wrote The Life and Death of the American City, she was fighting Robert Moses from demolishing all of Greenwich Village. Rachel Carson, The Birth of the Environmental Movement, or a great impetus to it, 1862, Silent Spring. Why do I put the two together? Environment and built environment, national environment built, because Newport is famous for both. You know, it's scenery. Frankly, if you look at the way I lay out the book, the story of historic preservation and the story of urban renewal, which is more successful economically? Now that is a complex debate, but when you restore and repair, but actually the better word is preserve, not over-restore, because they also talk about visions people have. And sometimes even preservationists tore things down, meaning in the 1960s, Colonial was paramount, but Victorian was not appreciated. I document that in Antoinette Downing's letter that said the whole context is important. So I think good design and proper zoning are what are key. You know, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zybeck are the founders of New Urbanism, which is basically old-fashioned urbanism with better building codes. And I traveled to Croatia with them about 3 years ago to lecture on those historic cities in Croatia, which are environmentally sound and walkable, and they study historic cities around the world. And that it's that type of holistic design that needs to be taken into account. And preservation is absolutely a part of economic development. It was seen by that in the preservation movement in Newport initially. But I always say there's more than one vision for a city. It's not just museums, it's not just tourism, it's not just business, it's everything. Because Ochre Point wasn't saved by only one thing. It's always the complex condition of business, residential, organizational function. Meaning you can't put a bell jar over the city.
Here's an interesting question, John. In what way, if any, has St. George's School influenced the architectural character of Newport? And this is from Otis.
In that, do you mean architecturally, the school or the students? I would just seek a little bit more clarity on what that question means.
Otis, if you want to unmute yourself and enhance that question a little bit, please do.
Sure. Hi, John. Thank you so much. This has been so informative, and what a great speaker. Really, it's just you're a very encouraging and admirable speaker.
Thank you.
Clearly in control of the content. Yeah, I'm just curious how. Well, I mean, I know a little bit about the history of the school and how it started off as a very small school, and then it's become, I don't know, really taken over. I think in a way. That particular area of Newport. And I just wondered if in your research you had come across anything that sort of lent, what instigated that? I mean, I imagine very much it was a local private school, and then it's become, you know, more, let's say, interstate. There's more, you know, more students from other areas, of course, international now. So maybe just speak a little bit on that, if you wouldn't mind.
I understand that St. George's is coming upon an important anniversary date as well. I believe it is. I don't know if it's a century but I was told that. Well, I didn't delve into it because I hope I'm not going to put my foot in my mouth, but I think St. George's is in Middletown. Am I correct in that?
Don't tell them, John. Don't tell them.
No, sorry. But technically, so I didn't delve into that area, Otis. However, I can tell you that whole zone, very Newport connected, because you have the Easton's Beach, the summer house community right after that, the subdivision of land leading up to that, very important. There are still older shingle style houses there. And then as you make your way up the hill to St. George's, that whole scenic viewscape was constantly visited, as many people know, by the painters who came to Newport, who went out to paint in Paradise Valley. And then St. George's, of course, did start out small. I would say also there's the house of Charlotte Cushman, a stick style house just beyond that, who very much came to summer in Newport, as did people. There was another question, I'll answer both. You know, did people go to Portsmouth? Well, Indian Avenue was a whole colony of summer houses. So St. George's, I think when it really made its mark in the landscape is when Ralph Adams Cram creates St. George's Chapel, because it's such a landmark. The building hugs the natural topography and was very much in that tradition of campus planning in the late Victorian period, with a picturesque landscape around it. But when John Nicholas Brown funded that building, it became very much a mark in the land. So for that, it didn't influence Newport per se, but I would say that area was influenced by Newport, you know, by the summer residents moving there, the school moving there, and then the Norman Burns Sanctuary being founded. You know, Grey Craig is created. That was once a gathering point for many summer colonists who'd go out there. A menagerie was kept there at one time. So that's my very long answer.
John, Charles Wharton asks, what was good and what was bad for Newport about the Jamestown ferry being replaced by the bridge in 1969?
Very good point. And there's a wonderful photograph from the Historical Society in the book of the bridge just coming in and where to decide to have the bridge exit. Do you know there were 9 possible points? one going right into downtown Newport, right into Thames Street, one going into Fort Adams, imagine. And they finally decided upon the one just at the end of the point because they didn't want the historic fabric of the point disturbed. That's why it's there. I think one of the problems with that is, as a small island, well, efficiency. Newport was finally linked to the mainland, number one. Mount Hope Bridge first, and then Newport Bridge. What is lost, though, was a pedestrian approach to entering Newport. And that, of course, has been something. I've been to many meetings over the decades about planning for this. This is something the Olmsteds brought up with traffic, and that's that traffic issue that's still with us. Because with a ferry, you arrive as a pedestrian instead of arriving as a car. And so the Newport Bridge, beautiful structure, by the way, I'm blessed for that. We're blessed for that. But it's what happened in so many American cities. Only the car.
Diana Pearson asks about the spring project and what do you think needs to be done to get people focused on this as an opportunity versus the loss of an artery out of town?
Well, it's one of those very historic sites, and it has great meaning. And, you know, I end my book, the last lines, I think I'm paraphrasing, you know, it is a place where dreams and ideals are sought and fought over in the streets of Newport. And this is a case for it. And everyone applies their own value system to a city. Preservationists, urban renewalists, artists, poets, writers, builders. I think there's an opportunity there. It has always been a transportation nexus, however, always. That's part of its character. And I think it's great to have a public space. I think it should have a function. I think there's some very good ideas about electric car, chargers, I think community bicycles. And I think the road that is proposed to be closed could be partly closed, meaning you could have it as a public gathering spot that cars don't use. It could just be a paved terrace sitting area, though. So it could be reopened when needed. I know I'm describing something that's visual, but it doesn't have to be entirely grassed over. I see a series of compromises. You know, the only city planning that went efficiently was the redesign of Paris in the 1860s because you had a total autocrat in charge, the Emperor Napoleon III. But that's about it. But I do think that approach could be interesting to both have a function, but make sure it can be adaptable at times of traffic, a parade, this kind of thing. And you're also maintaining the footprint of the original street, even in a terrace sitting area.
Jessica asks, are you working on another publication for the future?
I am engaged now, writing a book on Newport's landscape from many different archives. My interest is in whole regions now, you know, whole city. The whole city is a cultural landscape. That's my great interest in my scholarly work. I also write historical fiction for fun, but this is my interest. Whole cultural zones. They're more complicated, that's the challenge, but I'm more fueled by that. And I just feel the scholarship is needed. I talked with Richard Guy Wilson, a dear colleague and friend, professor from UVA, and he said, this work is needed. It hasn't been done. And I'm very lucky that Lisette Prince was very open to this vision first and foremost. And then when I brought the idea to Ruth, very open to this. So I'm very fortunate to have a group of people who had a vision say, yes, this needs to be done. This is a new way to look at an old thing, shall we say.
I think that's go ahead.
Sorry. I just have another question, Ruth. You go comment first, please.
No, I was going to say, I think that's a sort of a great ending question. And John, if you want to just, if you have something in sort of conclusion you'd like to say, I will say everyone should buy the book.
Yes, please. One thing I say is you can see Newport as a work of urban art, and I call it an accidental work of urban art, meaning it wasn't planned at once. It evolved over time, but as a result, it reflects the spirit of each age, or the spirits, I should say, and many different perspectives on a place. And I think it's important to look at in Newport in its totality and think about the character of that. Because cities are complex places, there are complex ideas, and that's what I'd like to leave everyone with. And buy the book, please. And I want to thank everyone. I want to thank again the Vision of Lisette, the support and collaboration of Ruth, the wonderful staff at the Historical Society, patient with me when I could not even operate a computer, and had technical difficulties. So thank you. And thank you everyone for coming and taking an interest in this project. It really is, it's truly appreciated.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.